Hello. So I'm just going to. I tried to set the live stream automatic, but then when I went in now, I couldn't work out how to get it started. So I had to make a new link. So I hope you can find me if you were on the link for the live stream. Okay, so I'm just finding my place in where we're up to for reading the start of The Wolf in a Suit, which is my book. I'm Anita Bentata, and it's my book with the 7 secrets inside relationship abuse, fairy tales and truths for women, community and professionals, though it's also really relevant, of course, for men, because this information is all about relationships, and we all enter relationships and want the best out of them. So I'm continuing on from in the introduction, who is telling tales. The Wolf in a Suit is not about casting all men as evil. This book is not about blaming or shaming anyone, including my family. My purpose for telling my story is speaking about what is unspoken. We need to speak about the unbearable feelings and unthinkable thoughts to get out of the confusion and integrate the new into the old, so we don't keep repeating the cycle and looping like an eternal nightmare. The purpose to telling my uncensored story is not to shock you or talk about certain people in a bad light. I invite you inside a real life, behind the closed doors, the truth about abuse, beyond shame and secrets, so you can really get a picture of what life is like. I invite you to notice the impactful actions and also what doesn't take place, but creates equal, if not greater, impact. Notice how it is to allow the honest, raw, unexaggerated depth of detail to create a picture of what living in abuse is really and truly like. Notice your responses. If you have an internal voice saying, no, she's exaggerating, or no, that's an unusual experience, that doesn't happen in my world. Just notice those responses. My uncensored story, of course, does not include every single detail. This is to protect some privacy for myself, my children, and everyone I write about, including the wolf. I speak of him as the wolf because I speak of the archetype possessing the man. I'm not speaking of the man's essence. I'm not judging. I am naming to tell a clear story. Open yourself to read my uncensored story, to feel, hear, and sense the actions and impact, rather than getting caught in facts, egos, or protecting statuses. I want people to be able to rise above the need to defend their worst face. Do we want to keep protecting what is wrong and lacking, or do we want to become the adults we teach our children to be? This story is for anyone who wants to understand what it's like to live in family violence. This story is for anyone who wants to understand about relationship abuse. If you don't know what abuse really is in all its fullness, you will have gaps in being able to protect your friend, your future self, your client, your children, or you may be in abuse to some degree now and not realize. Our society is still not comfortable with acknowledging abuse. So many women and men do not realize until they left the relationship that they were living with abuse. Our society does not regard the full spectrum of abuse as being real, which leaves people confused, in conflict, and immobilized. Society still asks the question, why doesn't she leave? Because society still does not accept the full spectrum of abuse, and so cannot get the full impact on how abuse shapes and limits any individual. I tell my story because it is my story through my eyes. It's not for me to tell another's story. And despite my years of therapy, something was incomplete. My story exists and has a rightful place. I needed to speak it publicly for my sake, for all women, for our children's sake, and for society to become more involved in picking up the pieces and creating change. Everyone's story of abuse deserves to exist and to be recognized and responded to as required. There needs to be room in the world for all the stories. After all, these are not just stories, these are people. We are real people with real lives. We are your sister, daughter, mother, grandmother, girlfriend, wife. How can we not make space for people and their stories? We need more survivor stories and wisdom. In, so I'm talking about survivor wisdom, influencing social policy and procedures in how to address this epidemic. If I tell my story with censorship, deletions, secrets, and excuses, then how can you ever really understand what abuse is like? If we keep protecting what is wrong, how can our society address the shame or have an opportunity to repair and fill those gaps? When healthy shame and accountability is not resting where it belongs, it rests on those more vulnerable. We need to become clear about the difference between mindless blame and shame that is used to control, deny, and maintain power, and healthy shame and accountability. Shame and blame are enacted by perpetrators not taking responsible action, and also by a society not enforcing consequences on perpetrators. This kind of blame and shame has no generative context to a bigger picture of mind, body, and social growth, and has no follow through for reparation or healing. There is a necessity in naming, holding accountability, and bearing healthy shame that is inevitable for healthy and inclusive change and action to take place. This type of naming and accountability may be mislabeled as blaming and shaming. However, naming should not be suffocated just because individuals and society feel healthy or toxic shame at the lack of appropriate response when naming takes place. We need a society that can respond to and differentiate between healthy shame and toxic shame. Otherwise, we are repeating patterns of abuse and remaining silent, walking on eggshells as a group, so that the perpetrator is not made to feel bad and defend and backlash out of shame, but also so society does not feel bad and expend as backlash defense out of shame. It is really important to understand these differences. So I hope that makes sense about the difference between healthy shame, because healthy shame mobilizes us to repair and change things. Yeah. But toxic shame disconnects us and just stops and inhibits any progressive, generative, activating responses. Those who don't have the shame to push back are currently bearing the shame that is not theirs to bear. So when the person that needs to be holding healthy shame isn't, very often the other person who's in the experience with them is experiencing the shame and it's not theirs to bear. I want everything to be in its rightful place. Let people hold their own egos and seek out services to assist with their own process to negotiate healthy or toxic shame or guilt rather than burdening the vulnerable. If they can't, let us build a society that holds those not accountable in a tighter boundary, even if they can own their accountability, rather than let the most silent or least aggressive one be dumped with the blame, shame, and guilt. I think my editor did a typo. I think that should be even if they can't own their accountability, rather than let the silent or least aggressive one be dumped with the blame, shame, and guilt. Let us make sure that shame and ego do not get in the way of returning to the bigger picture of a healthy, functional society. We need to be open to a generative way of addressing abuse in the family, relational, and social systems. So, this is my story, how I lived with the good and the bad aspects of fairy tales and life. So, I hope you get what I mean when I say the fairy tales in life, because the fairy tales, the stories that don't encompass the whole of what's going on, and how I traveled from being censored to becoming uncensored, being with the good and the bad, the named and the unnamed, the comfortable and the uncomfortable, the conscious and the unconscious, the mind and the body, the individual and the group. This brings in the whole. So the print on this page can be more than ink and patterns. Here is my personal and professional story laid bare. And I'm just going to pause for a moment because I just want to show you. So this part is my story, and this part is me talking professionally as a psychotherapist, where I bring in the fairy tales, though Little Red Riding Hood is scattered through my story. But in here, there's 9 other fairy tales that I tell the original, and then I retell in the context of new information about relationships and stress. Okay. So my story is my pain and my transformation. I've seen these fairy tales within me, like all of these fairy tales that I share in this book, I can relate to in my personal journey. And I think when you read each of the fairy tales, you'll relate to each of them to do with different elements of your life. I've seen these fairy tales within me also echoed in clients, the ideals, the wishes and hopes that trapped me in my personal story. As a professional, I unwrap the fairy tales and misguided hopes. I can be with that in me and others, the innocent Little Red Riding Hood, as I draw on my internal woodcutter to protect her from the tricksters out in the wild, those wolves that are waiting for the unsuspecting. Given that I'm a female and this true experience was with the perpetrator being male, I have written this book from that perspective. After all, I can only do justice to my story. However, everything that I write can be reversed, and it can also be applied to same-sex relationships. In my 20 plus years of professional experience, I've worked with women living in partner abuse, with partners being male, as well as men being victimized by partner abuse, with partners being female. And I've also worked with heterosexual and so I have worked with heterosexual and same-sex relationship abuse, with women and men with men as well. And that's why I don't talk about gender inequality, because for me, abuse is not founded on gender inequality, because I've seen it happen from men to women, women to men to men, women to women. But let's get back to the introduction. We all know something of the experience of living on eggshells at some point in our lives, the experience of being betrayed or of not feeling confident or safe enough to speak out. Perhaps we stay silent rather than stand by someone who is at risk because of some sense of risk of repercussions to ourselves or to the other. We don't speak at the time, feel bad about it, and don't speak about it later. It all becomes too hard or too much. The wolf in the suit is here to support anyone in their journey to be with the whole and not walk on eggshells. The Wolf in a Suit is a book for all women, for all men, and for anyone, professionals, friends, or family members who hold some concern about their own past or for someone in their lives. This book is for women who have been or still are living in family and partner violence. This book is for women who feel isolated and overwhelmed and not sure what to do or what is next. This book is for anyone who wants to protect or prevent anyone from being in any kind of toxic relationship. The Wolf in a Suit is also written for any professional who, through their work, meet with women who have a possibility of living with abuse that may have been missed, women who are stressed, women who have health problems. This includes psychiatrists, psychotherapists, counsellors, doctors, nurses, and various health professionals. There are many links between abuse and emotional, physical, and mental health. This book is also a valuable resource for police, lawyers, and mediators to understand and get in the inside story on the issue. both when it is spoken and when it is there but unspoken. There are ways to bring the story out when the person feels accepted, believed, and understood without putting words into someone's experience. The Wolf in a Soup can be read by anyone who wants to understand and use this information to make a difference in their community. I want more for you than to just be aware or understand. I want you to be able to receive a map that holds practical steps to navigate the way through, to have access to practical advice and information for women struggling with past or present family or relationship abuse, and advice for professionals, family, and friends on how to increase their identification of abuse and effective action. The seed to writing this book first came about in the 90s when I was running domestic violence groups in the counselling agency where I was first employed as a counsellor. The women participating felt comfortable with me, partially because they knew I wasn't just a therapist, that I'd lived through the same abuses as them. There was a sisterhood between us. The women spoke from their heart, asking me to be their voice, to tell the story of why we stay. They bestowed a trust in me to share their stories and voices and dispel the myths and judgments about why women stay. I hope I've honoured and adequately answered their request. Why write this book now? This abuse happened over 20 years ago. I'm free and safe now. My children are free and safe. I found as I edged closer to turning 50 that the whisperings to write this book were getting louder and louder. I did not want my desire to write to stay just that, a desire. I wanted this book to become a reality, to have a life of its own, to inform the gaps in the current conversation about abuse. I didn't want my pain to remain as resentment at the lack in our social and family system towards women and children in crisis. I did not want my dream to remain unlived. And for these important pieces, unable to reach a wider group of people beyond my immediate contact. I've been waiting to write this book for over 20 years. The opportunity has opened up now that my children are adults and parents themselves. My children have the mature depth of understanding that comes from their lives and their deep primal urge to protect their own children. With their permission, it's now okay for me to present our story. Even though abuse in the home is becoming more and more visible in media and social awareness, it's still a mystery to the larger society. Society often blames women for not seeing the abuse and leaving, yet many times society does not see the telltale signs of abuse. There is a shared difficulty to see what is there and how to respond. I want to contribute in speaking up and addressing these gaps. I wanted to leave a legacy, a contribution to changes within the community and society. I want all those years and moments of trauma, suffering, and helplessness to contribute to a positive change beyond my own positive growth, my own personal growth. To share the effects of how the abuses shaped and influenced me and my children, with the intention of our pain becoming part of a healing process for ourselves and others. Of course, I don't share all of my children's stories out of respect for them and their life stories. But I write what I can of what is relevant to assist you to understand the impact on our reality. I write so you understand that truth is more shocking than fiction and to encourage you to believe what appears unthinkable. I write so you can understand emotional abuse and not just physical abuse, so you can recognize abuse is not logical, abuse is unthinkable. I also wrote this book because of the anger that was still present in me. I became aware of this anger every time I heard something about abuse in the news and observed the lack of handling or appropriate inquiring that is still evident in the responses and reports. This anger, I'm saying it in past tense now because it's shifted. And when I publish my new book later this year, you'll understand why it's shifted. It goes beyond some of the attitudes and understandings that I have here. But this can be an important stage for someone in their journey. They might not necessarily be able to leap right to what I share in my next book. or not my next book, because I'm actually publishing 2 books this year. The first one is continuing on from this, and the second and the third one, which is, so the first one I'm writing this year, but it's the second book. It continues on from this, and the third one from this book, which is the second one for this year, has allowed me to truly be free from the frustration about family and society. Though writing this book did help, and what unfolded from it led me to where I am now. So it's all been helpful. Okay. So this anger sits within my deep disappointment and grief towards our culture, our society, the gaps in the legal and policing system, the gaps in the family system, and the gaps in my own family. Despite our advanced capabilities as a civilization, we hold a significant social deficit in communication and the emotional muscle to hear and speak. My anger motivates me to participate in clearing the cobwebs from misperceptions and myths that continue to prevail when someone is caught inside family and partner abuse. Those misperceptions and judgments do not recognize the complexities in being stuck. Those accusations about, but what did you do? After all, it takes 2. Or why did you stay? Whilst the man is let off the hook. Why are we not asking, why did he target a woman? Why did he persist to abuse and not find someone or something to help him stop and change? How come he could lose control with her, but not lose control with his boss or best friend? How come when he lost control, her belongings or pets were destroyed and not his? The question, why does she stay, is still not clearly understood in our society. I want to take you through my personal story and then unpack further awareness that developed through my 20 plus years of professional experience and my own long personal therapeutic journey. This way, we can move beyond the old questions and ask questions about him and about the society that stays silent and does not recognize emotional and psychological abuse as criminal. A society that believes physical and sexual abuse is criminal and our inner world is less important, creates a degraded society. I want you to truly understand and recognize why women get caught in the first place, why women don't leave or they keep returning, and how our society and family are part of that why. In my opinion, these questions about why she gets caught, why she doesn't leave, why she stays, why she returns, are all very different and important questions. But really, why are other questions not considered important? Why do the men abuse and why don't they stop? Why does society not step in? Why do we have a system that relies on proof when abuse happens behind closed doors? Why can't we explore a more accurate and broader concept of proof? Why is a child's word asked for but then not listened to? Why is the natural and developmental way a child communicates predominantly through behaviour not taken as evidence? Why are we not more inclusive of all the evidence and material that is available, which is not currently valued in the legal system? Why are these questions not loud and present or louder in our conversations? Why do we presume that a woman should know before she can know? Who is able to put up their hand and say truthfully that in their life they have always been able to leave before something worse happened, whether it's a bad habit, an addiction, a job, or something else? Who is able to say they never overstayed and tried longer for the possibility of a happier outcome? How many people have said they didn't leave that job that was killing their soul because they couldn't afford the risk of the unknown, of not having financial security? Why are women in abuse expected to be able to get out of the clutches of something more than anyone else? Don't most people have something they can relate to that they succumb to? The Wolf in a Suit is about those binds of secrecy and abuse that remain hidden in the home. In writing this book, I came to understand the act of walking on eggshells is in far more detail than I thought possible. I already knew about the secrecy and shame when living in abuse and no one becomes involved. There is a further trauma of walking on eggshells through the court and police system in an effort to be believed and making sure you don't come across as a revengeful, spiteful woman who has no proof, so she must be lying. Most abuse happens behind closed doors, perhaps because he knows he's doing the wrong thing. There is a reinforced belief that only one of the two differing stories can be acknowledged, that the story is only real when witnessed by another. I wanted to write a book to explain why we need to listen to and believe one person's story and not insult them by claiming that it is only valid if another can speak of or see it. In writing The Wolf in a Suit, I came to realize more about the layers of walking on eggshells beyond the survivor's experience. That society walks on eggshells too. I had lived with family abuse and neglect, knowing it through experience while asleep, like asleep to the knowledge about what abuse is, and later knowing it through becoming awake, and later intimately knowing it through naming and unpacking what happened. This unpacking led me to realize the many layers of society also walking on eggshells. I was blown away how pervasive walking on eggshells is through society. Denial, it's none of my business. Toxic shame, overwhelm, white lies, excuses, blame, and more. Start to look for it around you. Is it there? We need the broad focus, not just the narrow focus, to address the whole. Even when I could not consciously name it, I felt and knew the unnameable experience of being abused. It felt wrong, and it kept me walking on eggshells on a daily basis, year in, year out, because no one beyond me, personally or socially, acknowledged the full reality of abuse. I knew the experience of being behind closed doors, people around me acting as if no boundaries were broken, keeping secrets due to overwhelm, fear, and confusion, and with the clear messages, verbal and non-verbal, not to betray another of their blinded and blinkered view of themselves. When no one around you acknowledges reality, it is hard to be the one to make a fuss or trust the reality you feel. When I escaped and went through court, I became aware of how the legal system was another form of abuse that denied my reality because it was my word against his. There is abuse through our system still, on so many levels. I started to become curious about why this societal power, denial, and controlling abuse is not shifting when people do not want abuse in society. In recent times, I came to realize more about how friends and family also walk on eggshells around people they have concerns about. Our society doesn't teach how to navigate the wolves. Far too often, the wolves are running the show. As a society, people don't know how to bring up concerns, uncertain if it is any of my business or whether to trust the concerns that they have as being valid. It leaves many people walking on eggshells in case speaking up would mean a backlash on their friendship or on the relationship of the person they are concerned about. It is understandable. It is uncomfortable to talk about abuse or toxic relationships, but staying silent is not the solution. This is not a comfortable conversation, let alone to know what to say or do when you're only receiving bits of information. A part of me automatically pipes up now to say that even if you don't know what to say or do, you can name some version of this. You could say to someone, I don't know what to say right now, but it seems like something is not right. How does it seem to you? I wish someone had been able to name what I could not and open a door to enable me to come back to life. I wish someone had tried and not given up. There is no perfect conversation or outcome, but there is a better way than what is currently happening. In writing about my experience with the police and court system and the failures that I experienced in the lack of protection for me and my children, I came to realize that maybe even the police and the legal system also walk on eggshells. This pattern of abuse in the relationship, in families, is also in our legal system. Not in exactly the same way, And I don't want to let them off the hook in their part of being accountable in their role. But the pattern of violence and denying reality is even bigger than just in the relationship. This is not to excuse the system, but to consider the bigger picture. After all, every system is made up of people, and everyone comes from a family. So, if everyone comes from a family and 1 in 3 women experience abuse in their lifetime, then maybe there is a large percentage of people in the entire system denying or minimizing abuse to defend against their own family or ancestral story. The statistic of 1 in 3 women having experienced physical violence means abuse is happening in almost every family, doesn't it? What about the presence of emotional abuse, often the precursor to all other violence? What about all the wolves who create damage purely through psychological and emotional abuse? What does this mean for our perception of a stable, functional, and healthy society? How does this awareness impact the health and choices of the tribe if we truly absorb the reality of how prevalent abuse is? What would happen if, as a society, we really recognize these failures? Stop and think of the amount of perpetrators everywhere who deny their own behaviors and patterns of control, hurting and punishing others over and over again, day in and day out, year in and year out. Stop and think about our functional society that allows these perpetrators to abuse the vulnerable. How many school teachers, doctors, nurses, and police officers are helpless to a system that does not identify or intervene appropriately? Sure, we will always miss some perpetrators, but we have the ability to change the degree so that fewer people slip through the system, so that we restrain many more perpetrators and protect many more vulnerable women, children, and men. What would happen to society if perceptions about masculinity and patriarchy were more actively deconstructed? So much of our way of schooling, farming, work, war, politics, and law is based on patriarchy and has become disconnected from rhythm, cycle, instinct, and nature. What would happen to society if perceptions about femininity were significantly reconstructed? If women's knowledge about the body, life, and power were incorporated and visible in all the areas of work, law, politics, war, schooling, and farming, and all areas of life? Is the broader society level of walking on eggshells in place to avoid the challenges and changes these questions bring, rather than shaking up the system of power and the society's perception of men, women, and how our society really is structured? These are important concepts to question and explore. But let us return to the personal face of abuse. Abuse is still so misunderstood, yet accommodated. When we connect all the pieces and know the full extent of all the types of abuse and how our habits and society are involved in maintaining the pattern of abuse, then maybe we can turn a corner. I believe we have an allergic reaction to being affected, hurt, and vulnerable. We deny another person's experience, so we don't open the door to personal pain that we don't want to re-experience and don't know what to do about. What you deny in yourself, you deny in another. What if, instead of denying ourselves and others, we include and allow? We are so fortunate today to have access to therapies that don't just talk, but gently and effectively release trauma from the body, as well as therapies that support the neural pathways which become interrupted and disconnected due to overwhelm. What if we saw therapy as part of the ongoing process of growing as a human, evolving, transforming, and identifying this growth as a personal strength instead of the stigma of having something wrong? After all, we regularly service our cars, knowing that by being on the road, they will inevitably be affected and need checking and restoring to their optimal condition. Why do we ignore how our own system runs instead of running ourselves into the ground on so many levels? We run our business lives in reaction, in a survival mode, instead of being the powerful, creative beings we are. I've got one more page till I reach another pause in my introduction. There are so many reasons why I wanted to write this book. Most abuse is emotional and mental, unrecognized by the system despite often being the forerunner to physical and sexual abuse. Emotional and mental abuse is much more prevalent. Depression, addiction, suicide, ill health, and poor social connections are all associated with emotional and psychological abuse. Often the media focuses on physical and sexual abuse, while the other forms fall through the cracks as if they don't exist. Yet everyone who has been abused will emphasize the deep harm of emotional and psychological abuse and its harm on the self and identity. These types of abuses are far more damaging on every level: mental health, emotional health, future relationships, future employment, physical health, being able to trust yourself and others again, and living a full life. Emotional and mental abuse falls through the cracks, yet these methods of psychological and emotional torture, as well as isolation, are used in war and considered war crimes. It's not just physical and sexual abuse impacting and wounding women, children, and men. We need to recognize the full spectrum of abuse. While we are talking about secrets, omissions, and myths, family violence isn't just happening in lower socio-economic circumstances. It doesn't always involve drugs. Let's not excuse the abuse as a symptom of alcohol. Not everyone who drinks to excess is violent or abusive. Not everyone who has a mental illness is abusive. Abuse happens in every suburb and across all ages and socio-economic backgrounds. In my teenage years, I remember my boyfriend and I driving to an older relative's home in a wealthy suburb to help her secretly leave her abusive husband. I want everyone to understand the real life experience and deep wounds from attacks on the sense of self through all the types of abuses, many of which are still not fully recognized. So I tell my story of abuse in part one, and in part two, I describe all the types of abuse for you to gain a greater understanding towards how I see the layers and challenges in what maintains our whole society and individual immobilization. There are probably more types of abuse than you realize. I describe in detail about the non-physical abuses and how they still impact on the physical body. Part two of my book is where I outline my professional understandings, offering key insights, information, and suggestions with specific steps outlined towards the end of each chapter on how to integrate the material contained in each chapter. I suggest different ways of taking this information and making meaningful use of it in your own personal process, either as a woman who has or is currently experiencing family violence, or as a professional to become more aware of vulnerable women, men, and children trapped inside family violence. Please remember, if you are in an unsafe situation and you are reading this book, you may want to leave your copy at a friend's home and read it while there, or access the ebook to read. I break down all the complex layers involved with abuse in the home in easy and clear ways. These complex layers intermingle and confuse the mental, physical, biological, and neurological layers of self, leaving those vulnerable in states of survival and shell shock. When practitioners and society do not know all the complex layers, assistance is severely limited. Understanding the complex layers and the impact of abuse on all the different parts and systems that shape you or another is really important to be able to address the complexity and confusion that is wrapped up in abuse. Looking at and processing is about being able to look at all the parts and how they connect as a whole. So I'm going to pause there because we've come to another section. Actually, it's just 2 more pages, but I might leave it till tomorrow. I will read the final, 4 sides, 2 pages. And I thought I was reading, I thought in that section of the introduction I did cover to do with men and evil, so I will double check in case I skipped a bit. But I will read the last bit of the introduction tomorrow, and maybe I'll read a little bit the day after of the first fairy tale so that you get a snapshot of it. And please contact me if you've got any questions or leave any comments in the thread below. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you would want to hear more of. It's been really interesting for me to read because I haven't picked up and read part of my book since I was checking the editing. I went over the editing many, many times with the editor and to make sure that it was clear. And I can see that I've learnt more about how to communicate. I think that introduction is very full, and I know my next book is going to be quite different. But I also know that when we get into the chapters with the stories, it's quite different because of the content and the structure of what I'm sharing in the rest of the book. So I will read the last bit tomorrow of the introduction, and then the next morning I will read you a little bit of Rumpelstiltskin. So I'd love to hear your feedback and any suggestions or comments, and I will see you tomorrow at the same time.